What can we learn from reflecting on the Roman emperors before Marcus Aurelius? What was the balance of power between the Senate and the emperors? How could a rogue emperor be removed? What role did the Roman army play in politics and succession? Why were there 5 good emperors in a row? Why did Hadrian consolidate rather than expand the empire? What effect did this policy have on the Roman Empire? Could Hadrian sometimes be just as cruel as Commodus? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. When examining the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good Roman emperors, we need to understand the broad sweep of the early history of the Roman Empire that succeeded the Roman Republic. And the Roman state actually celebrated the 900th anniversary of its traditional founding by the mythical Romulus and Remus shortly after Marcus Aurelius was born. Marcus Aurelius is a fascinating figure in history. He was one of the great Roman Stoic philosophers based on his meditations, and he was also the last of the 5 good Roman emperors. Emperors who did not inherit their position, but were chosen for their temperament and abilities. Some of his meditations extol Christian principles, but they also has references against Christians, and many historians, ancient and modern, say he persecuted Christians. What is even more remarkable is that not only modern Christians want to believe that he didn't persecute Christians, but many ancient Christians admired his philosophies and felt the same way. And this may have included St. Justin Martyr. The early Roman emperors and the 5 good emperors through Marcus Aurelius had very little to do with Christians and had almost no personal contact with Christians. Nero famously, viciously persecuted Christians, but there was little desire by succeeding emperors in this period to seek out Christians for active persecution. Now, Emperor Diocletian would viciously persecute the Christians, but that would be centuries after Marcus Aurelius. After reviewing the biographies of Marcus Aurelius and his son and successor, Commodus, who was an emperor as bloodthirsty as Nero, but who did not persecute the Christians, we will reflect on the history of Christian persecutions through the reign of Marcus Aurelius and his son, Commodus. And we will also reflect on the ordinary lives of Romans in the time of Marcus Aurelius. First, let's go back to the reign of Julius Caesar and the early Roman emperors. One weakness of the late Roman Republic is that the troops owed their allegiance not to the Roman Republic, but to the general they served under. Because of this, the Roman Senate passed a law requiring generals to enter the city of Rome unattended. Their troops had to remain on the other side of the Rubicon. The politics of the late Roman Republic under Cato and Cicero and many lesser senators were violent and unstable. Julius Caesar resolved the chaos of the Roman Republic when his troops crossed the Rubicon, which in the short run meant civil war. The important political questions in the Roman Empire were, how much power would the Roman Senate retain in the empire? And how can you remove a bad emperor? And you can see the broad outline of the reign of the various Roman emperors in the early Roman Empire. A conspiracy of over 60 senators plotted the assassination of Julius Caesar. His friend Brutus was among those who stabbed him to death on the floor of the Senate in 44 BC. Now his family was descended from the Brutus who had expelled the kings from Rome nearly 5 centuries earlier at the birth of the Roman Republic. Surprisingly, in his will, Julius Caesar declared his nephew Octavian, who would also be known as Caesar Augustus, as his heir. His assassination was controversial, but Octavian eventually prevailed after winning the War of Actium, a civil war he fought against Marc Antony and Cleopatra, and then he became the sole emperor of Rome. And the remarkable last Greek queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, had successfully seduced both Julius Caesar, then Marc Antony, who were both married, and later many painters. When in Egypt, those around Julius Caesar did not want them to meet. She had her attendants smuggle her into his quarters rolled in a rug. After his death, she next seduced Marc Antony, but in the naval battle of Actium, she and her fleet fled and sailed away, guaranteeing defeat. Many millennia later, Cleopatra in the guise of Elizabeth Taylor nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox when her movie went over budget. It was the most expensive film at that time. Cleopatra, in character, started an adulterous affair with Richard Burton, attracting scandalous headlines. Now, back in the 1st century, wisely, Octavian refused to meet with Cleopatra in private, guaranteeing that he too would not be seduced. We are in luck. Plutarch has written biographies of Julius Caesar, Brutus, Crassus, Pompey, and Marc Antony, as have other ancient historians. So sometime later we will reflect on the lives of these noble Romans. Although he was deferential to the Senate, Octavian was reluctant to adopt the customary grandiose titles of an emperor, although he did hold the real absolute power. This public humility dissuaded the senators from plotting to assassinate him, much like they did his uncle, although he certainly never gave them the chance. Octavian drastically expanded the frontiers of the empire, which meant lower taxes for the Italians, since these conquests flooded the labor market with slaves, and large amounts of booty were appropriated. As time passed, the Roman Senate lost more and more of its residual power, but the emperor could not run the empire by himself. Even when the Senate itself was powerless, many of the Roman bureaucratic officials were drawn from the senatorial and equestrian ranks. During the first century of the Roman Empire, some emperors were good, some were bad, and some were mad, including Caligula, who, in addition to proclaiming himself divine, may have planned to appoint as consul his horse. Caligula was incredibly unpopular, since he murdered many senators. And finally, the ancient version of the Secret Service, the Pretorian Guard, assassinated Caligula. Now the Roman soldiers found a successor, Claudius, hiding in the curtains, and surprisingly, Claudius was a somewhat competent emperor. Under the guidance of his wise Stoic tutor Seneca, the first few years of Nero's reign suggested that he too would be a good emperor. But his megalomania and cruelties consumed him. He martyred Christians as scapegoats after Rome burned, and he also murdered many senators and opponents. In retirement, Seneca often pondered the topic of suicide, because he knew one day Nero's soldiers would be at his door. Now, after Nero was compelled to commit suicide, the Roman Empire endured the chaotic year of the four emperors. The eventual victor, General Vespasian, brought stability to the empire, though he refused to share power with the Senate and was succeeded by his son Titus, then his son Domitian. Vespasian and Titus were effective and popular emperors, gaining the approval of the Senate. Although Domitian started out in their footsteps, he attracted opposition and was assassinated. And yes, Vespasian and Titus were the generals who put down the rebellion in Israel, which ended in that famous siege of Masada. And what were the problems of succession of the Roman emperors, and what was the status of the Roman army? The only way to rid the empire of a bad emperor was death, either by natural causes or by assassination. Usually, when an unpopular emperor was assassinated, there were periods of instability where multiple emperors were in power for only a few months before they were overthrown in short civil wars. Usually, these civil wars were waged among the various Roman legions for the generals competing for power. These civil wars didn't affect many ordinary people in Rome, as these legions typically did not lay siege to cities or plunder or kidnap ordinary citizens as they did when expanding the borders of the empire. Of course, there was some plundering and kidnapping, no doubt. I mean, that always happens in war in the ancient world. And the composition of the Roman army itself changed during the centuries of the Roman emperors. The Roman legions were manned by professional soldiers. If they served for 25 years, they earned a cash bonus of 13 years' salary. This was like a lottery, as half of these soldiers died before retirement. But those who did retire in the first century bought land in Italy and caused much political instability. Now, in later centuries, many retired soldiers settled in towns in the provinces, binding them more tightly to Rome. And the percentage of Italians in the Roman legions likewise declined. Under Octavian, about 70% of the legionnaires were Italian, and this declined to around a quarter of the legions by the year 100. By the time Marcus Aurelius was emperor, only 2% of the legionnaires were Italian. And this also applied to leaders, although the top leadership was only open to Roman citizens. As MacLean, the biographer of Marcus Aurelius, observes, the Roman Empire was an empire of conquest, and this simple fact had profound consequences for society at every level. The empire's main sources of income were tribute paid by the conquered, indirect taxes on the sale of slaves, customs duties, and revenues from its states, mines, and other properties. Roman taxation was always relatively low, since the taxpayers were the defeated, and a land tax would not be passed until the 4th century. And now we'll tell the story of Nerva and Trajan, the first of the 5 good emperors. Domitian's successor, Emperor Nerva, was well connected to both the Senate and the emperors, and was the first of the 5 good emperors, all of whom were selected as the best Roman for the post, none of whom inherited their position. He was an old man when he was elevated to be emperor. He promised the Senate he would consult with them on all decisions, and that he would not put to death any senator. And he recalled those who Domitian had exiled. He distributed much land to the poor of Italy and annulled many taxes. Now, we cannot improve upon Will Durant's description of Nerva. With the assassination of Domitian, the principle of heredity disappeared for a century from Roman monarchy. The Senate had never recognized inheritance as a source of sovereignty. Now, after 123 years of submission, it reasserted its authority. And as in Rome's beginnings, it had chosen the king. Now it named one of its own princeps and imperator. But the Pretorian Guard was not happy. After less than a year after he was named emperor, they besieged the palace, killing several of the emperor's counselors. Will Durant said that Nerva offered his throat to the swords of the soldiers, but they spared him. Humiliated, Nerva offered to abdicate, but his friends persuaded him, instead, to return to Augustus' example and adopt as his son and successor a man acceptable to the Senate and capable not only of ruling the empire, but the Pretorian Guard as well. Nerva thus adopted as his son and successor the popular general Trajan. The stress must have been too much for Nerva. He died shortly afterwards after a reign of only 16 months. Now the Roman Empire was at its zenith after the conquests of Emperor Trajan. He expanded the Roman Empire into England, expanded the provinces of North Africa and Egypt, and expanded eastward into Romania and Parthian Persia. The Senate gave him the title of Optimus, the best of emperors. As you can see, the reign of the five great emperors lasted for nearly 100 years. Will Durant describes his character. Trajan never ceased to be a general. His presence was commanding. His features were undistinguished but strong. Tall and robust, he was wont to march on foot with his troops and ford with full armament the 100 rivers they had to cross. His courage showed a stoic impartiality between life and death. Trajan asked the Senate's opinions on all matters of moment and discovered that he might wield nearly absolute power if he never used absolute speech. The Senate was willing to let him rule if he would observe the forms that maintained its dignity and prestige. Like the rest of Rome, it now loved security too much to be capable of freedom. But rather than continue the conquests, his successor Hadrian consolidates the Roman Empire. Now, when Trajan died during the campaign in the east in August 117 AD, Hadrian, commander of the Syrian troops, readily gained their support. But Hadrian felt threatened. He was unable to wait for the support of the Senate, so he executed those he thought would oppose him. That included several senators, which earned him the everlasting hostility and suspicion of the Senate. Now, on the other hand, the historian Will Durant states that those opposing generals were executed by orders of the Senate, and that Hadrian objected that he had nothing to do with this, which meant that this history is a bit foggy. Trajan's successor Hadrian contracted the empire slightly, abandoning some of Trajan's eastern conquests to more defensible borders. He built the famous Hadrian Wall across northern England. Hadrian was a Jekyll and Hyde emperor. At his worst, he could be cruel and heartless to those beneath him, although he was never insanely cruel as the mad emperors of Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. At his best, he was both an excellent administrator and a savvy planner, seeking to ensure the stability of the empire for the next 2 generations. Since Hadrian had no heirs, he adopted as his successor Marcus Aurelius. But soon before his death, he also decided to adopt a relative, Antoninus Pius, as his son and immediate successor. Hadrian insisted that Antoninus Pius would in turn adopt as his sons both young Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, and designate Marcus Aurelius as a successor, guaranteeing a smooth succession for 2 generations. Now, in addition to his careful succession planning, historians view these 3 main aspects of the 2-decade rule of Hadrian: Hadrian's open and predatory homosexuality, and Hadrian's peace policy reversing the trend of Roman conquest, from the strong emperors from Julius Caesar to his predecessor Trajan, and Hadrian's tireless travels throughout the vast Roman Empire. Hadrian violated social norms by not marrying, and pursuing both adolescent and grown male lovers publicly without discretion. His most famous lover was Antoninus, who died mysteriously at age 20. Many speculate it was a suicide. Since Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius were both practicing Stoics, they could not condone Hadrian's behavior, although they dare not object lest their adoptions be cancelled. Homosexuality and pederasty, or men-boy love, was less tolerated in Roman culture than it was in Greek culture. No doubt there were varying opinions on this in the ancient world, but nobody conducted opinion polls back then. But many did condone the Greek attitudes on sexuality. And what were these Greek standards? Now, in Plato's dialogues on love, Socrates reflected on how divine love was superior to the often predatory nature of romantic or carnal love, which in Greek culture was often the homosexual love between the pursuing older lover and a younger adolescent boy. While the Romans were not as accepting of homosexuality as were the Greeks, they did tolerate homosexuality and pederasty, or men-boy love. Once the younger boy became an adolescent at age 20, he would graduate to a bisexual lifestyle, where he would eventually marry and have children. Hadrian's peace policy was controversial. He abandoned Trajan's conquests in Dacian Romania and Parthian Persia to concentrate on consolidating the Roman Empire to more defensible borders. He changed the status of Armenia from a Roman province to an independent client state. The problem was that the Roman Empire needed continual expansion, including war booty and slaves, to fund the empire and feed the growing population of Rome. And this policy certainly did not prevent future conflict with Parthian Persia. Historians debate whether Hadrian's defensive posture was wise. Were there prosperous provinces left to conquer on the frontiers? On the other hand, the successful expansion of the Byzantine Empire by the Emperor Justinian several centuries later nearly bankrupted his empire. And finally, Hadrian constantly traveled through the Roman Empire. Many of the provinces had never seen a Roman emperor. This certainly strengthened the bonds between Rome and various provinces, and he listened and resolved many of their complaints. And these constant travels meant that he spent little time in Rome, which meant that he had little contact with the senators and Roman officials. Hadrian spent lavishly on building programs both in Rome and in the provinces, and like previous emperors, kept the common people quiet with bread and circuses, lavish gladiator and wild beast shows in the arena. Now, Hadrian saw himself as a polymath, and he indeed was well read in philosophy. He showed political acumen when he forgave tax debts, making him popular with the Romans in Italy, and he was generous in granting donatives, or periodic bonuses, to his troops. But he had a dark side. He foreshadowed the disastrous Emperor Commodus. He could be capricious, murdering senators at both the beginning and end of his reign. Hadrian loved watching his gladiators, and even fought in the arena himself to prove his skill with arms. Although Hadrian's reign was mostly peaceful, there were conflicts and rebellions in England, Spain, Germania, and North Africa. But his most challenging was the violent Jewish Bar Kokhba revolt near the end of his reign. And the rebels' meticulous planning led to their conquest of Palestine, but the Romans were the eventual victors in a years-long war of attrition, where close to 1,000 villages were razed, with high casualties on both sides. Jewish casualties may have been in the hundreds of thousands. And his successors basically continued his policy of consolidating the reign of the empire rather than expanding. Although he had a long reign, Antoninus Pius became emperor late in life and rarely left Rome. Marcus Aurelius did have ambitions to expand the empire in Germania, but he died before this conquest. And his son Commodus wanted to simply secure his northern borders so he could return to Rome and fight with gladiators. And his successor Antoninus Pius stays in Rome. Hadrian had originally intended for Marcus Aurelius to succeed him as emperor, but near the end of his reign, when his health was failing, Hadrian surprised everyone by adopting as a son and successor Antoninus Pius, a relatively unknown senator. Why did Hadrian choose Antoninus Pius? The historian MacLean recounts Hadrian's answer. The main reason was Antoninus' very lack of distinction and his middle age. For an older man might be senile and make grievous mistakes, while a younger man might be rash and headstrong. Antoninus was a perfect blank slate. He was a steady character, had no real enemies or ongoing feuds, had no siblings and just one daughter. Although Hadrian had ensured that Marcus Aurelius would be in the line of succession to be Roman emperor, Hadrian is missing from his long list in his meditations of those to whom Marcus Aurelius feels a debt of gratitude. Quite likely this was due to the years of terror he spent while forced to live in Hadrian's household, wondering if he would be a victim rather than a future emperor. Prominent on that list in his meditations is his predecessor Antoninus, who also ensured his continuing Stoic education. Antoninus was the opposite of Hadrian. He put an end to the cult of sex with young boys. Perhaps Hadrian's plan was that Antoninus would be a placeholder emperor, reigning for half a dozen years until Marcus Aurelius was ready for the throne. But God, rather than men, determines how long we will live on this earth, and he reigned for over 2 decades. His first step was to convince the Senate to accept the deification of the hated Hadrian, and declare amnesty for all who were condemned by Hadrian. He gained moral authority because he was willing to govern with the Senate as a partner. And how did he govern differently from Hadrian? What reforms did he enact? Well, for one, Antoninus separated the state funds from his personal wealth. He rejected Hadrian's cult of pederasty or men-boy love. Like Marcus Aurelius, he detested sycophants. He was willing to listen to experts and include senators in discussions on policy. And McLean's words, like Marcus, Antoninus had a casual attitude to privilege and wealth, treating them both without arrogance and without apology. If there was good food and wine, he enjoyed them, but if not, he did not miss them. He was reliable and predictable. He preferred tradition. He disliked change. But like Hadrian, he minimized taxation, at one point forgiving debts to the state. In his later years, Antoninus nominated Marcus as consul with the title of Caesar so he could assist with administering the empire, and this foreshadowed the tetrarchy, or rule of four, 2 emperors, 2 Caesars, that Diocletian would set up many decades later. Later, he appointed Lucius Veras as co-consul with Marcus. As his health faltered, Marcus assumed more administrative duties. Although Antoninus permitted Marcus to participate in introducing legislation before the Senate, he also kept a close eye on him. In his entire reign, Marcus only spent 2 nights away from his company. When Marcus was elevated to Roman emperor, he soon made Lucius Verus as co-emperor. Perhaps this was an unwise decision, but fortunately Lucius never challenged his position. He was more interested in carousing than governing. In his memories of Antoninus Pius and his meditations, Marcus Aurelius describes the ideal emperor for his son Commodus. Take Antoninus as your model always. Think of his qualities: energy in pursuit of the rational, steadiness, calmness, gentleness, modesty, sense of reverence, his intellectual curiosity, and his lust for life. He tolerated unfair criticism, was contemptuous of informers, never made snap judgments, was patient and unhurried, an unrivaled judge of character. He rejected jealousy and character assassination, disdained empty rhetoric, knifed through to the essentials, lived in a Spartan way, worked hard, often until dusk, and ate sparingly. Antoninus was a good friend who knew his own mind and was not swayed by the last person to speak. He was constant and was not forever changing his mind or lacking a fixed set of values. He was not a prima donna. He could tolerate criticism and was even pleased if his ideas could be improved upon. He was deeply religious, but not superstitious. Think on all of this, so when your time comes, your conscience will be as clear as his. But in perhaps the most important aspect of their rules, Hadrian did outshine Marcus Aurelius. Hadrian set in place a succession guaranteeing that the last 2 good emperors would govern the Roman Empire wisely with justice. Unfortunately, Marcus Aurelius spent the latter years of his reign as emperor fighting the rebellious German tribes on Rome's northern frontier. This video shows the prehistory for our video on the biography of Marcus Aurelius. But Marcus Aurelius put his love for his son, Commodus, over his obligations to ensure that the best man would succeed him as emperor. His son would turn out to be one of the most sadistically cruel emperors in history, equaling Nero, in the end plunging the empire into chaos when he was assassinated by his Pretorian Guard, backed up by senators who feared for their lives. As was the case for Nero, the assassination of Commodus led to the chaotic year of 5 emperors. This was followed by more than 4 decades of emperors, some good, some bad, some forgettable, that led to another year of 6 emperors. And it was not until more than 4 decades later that Emperor Diocletian and then Constantine stabilized the Roman Empire, splitting it up into a more defensible Eastern Empire and Western Empire that enabled the Byzantine Empire to survive for another millennium, while the Western Roman Empire succumbed to chaos. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Many historians complain about the lack of ancient biographers and historians the caliber of Plutarch who can offer commentary on the life of these later Roman emperors. But that does not mean a total lack of sources. We know the history of the 5 good emperors in amazing detail. The modern historian Frank McLean's biography of Marcus Aurelius is over 500 pages. About half the pages are background information, including deep analysis of the emperors preceding him. Anthony Burley also has an excellent, though slimmer, biography of Marcus Aurelius, and he does cover his predecessor emperors in some detail. Although it is dated, written in 1944, Durant's history, Caesar and Christ, is also a rich source of history and background, plus he's very quotable and an excellent writer. We have a more thorough discussion of our sources in our video on the biography of Marcus Aurelius. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.